An uprising saw its second anniversary.
But this wasn't a moment for celebration. The ongoing battle has seen more than 70,000 people killed, with more than 1 million Syrians now refugees.
And with a divided opposition, a disunited international community, and a defied Assad, this final chapter of this tragedy seems far off.
Well, joining us now in the studio to guide us through the crisis is Tawfiq Rahim, the director of Globesite. Tawfiq, welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to have you back on.
Thank you very much for being with us. So here we are at the 2-year mark, moving into the 3rd year of this conflict. Where do we stand right now, in your opinion?
Well, definitely, I think 2 years on, we're at a very different point than March 17th, 2011. The day after March 17th, the Friday, you had the first deaths in Syria on March 18th. At that time, it seemed that those deaths, each of them was an objectionable event that raised protests in a number of cities. We had people coming out in solidarity to the funerals in Dara at the time in southern Syria, coming out in solidarity in Homs and Hama and other cities when there would be 5 or 6 deaths. And what we've seen is that it's become normal in this conflict today for there to be 60 to 70 deaths. And we really are in a very violent and protracted conflict that is far removed from just that simple, if you can call it that, democratic uprising 2 years ago. So that's where we stand on the high level.
That's the thing, the figures are shocking. I think it's every day we hear more and more people getting killed. There's certainly no sign of slowing down. A big focus recently in the past week, of course, we've seen the UK and France signal they're looking to potentially arm the rebel fighters.
Right.
If this does happen, if they follow through, do you think this will be a real game changer for the whole crisis?
Well, in the protracted nature of the conflict, where you look at there being 2 sides and the Assad regime being armed by Iran still, they're talking about flyover flights through Iraq, and with the support of Russia, people still look at the situation of the rebels, the Free Syrian Army, as disparate as that might be, as having less arms in this asymmetric conflict, especially because the EU so far has had an arms embargo. And the UK and France and others are saying, let's dislodge that arms embargo. At the end of the day, I think that will just make the situation more violent. Now, where they're putting their bets is that this violence, if it's on the strength of the opposition, will lead to the collapse of the Assad regime. This may be the case, and you may have a very bloody climax through the summer, let's say in the fall, with the rebel forces advancing on Damascus. I would posit that the situation will simply become more chaotic if the answer is just more arms. And most Syrians are starting to see that. You had the reverberation from the leadership of the Syrian National Council, and the president of that, Moaz Khatib, or the head of that, where he said he wants to have a dialogue, obviously under certain conditions, to create an avenue for a political solution or transition. And it means that there needs to be some type of 2-step solution. It can't just be more arms. That really will not lead to anything substantive without any other efforts.
I mean, looking at this idea of this 2-step solution, considering what's gone, considering how bitter the conflict has been up to this point, how is a dialogue even really possible? What kind of 2-step solution are we looking at, something that's feasible?
I think there is no one solution or silver bullet that anybody can point to. If you go back to Iraq in 2006 and 2007, it was so intractable that it really took a series of steps to create the space for a solution, and that's where we are in Syria. There is no one thing that somebody can put down and say this is the blueprint for how to solve the conflict. What needs to happen is probably some type of de-escalation that reduces the violence in certain areas and allows even the opposition to re-strengthen or reconsolidate their control in newly acquired cities like Raqqa. Right now, with the violence, it's hard to secure those supply lines. It's hard to maintain the control over the cities because you're still being bombarded by the air. So this would also give, if there was almost an opening, would give the opposition room to build up its governance structure. So far they have, yes, Free Syrian Army units and local councils, but there isn't really the emergence or the semblance of an opposition government that's in country. So far the Syrian National Coalition is essentially fully outside the country. So we're not really clear what would replace the Assad regime still now, how that would move in, and how they can expand their reach inside Syria, except through a campaign of sustained violence where disparate groups are taking over.
I mean, there's also been a lot of criticism about the UN, about the Arab League as well.
Sure.
Do you feel that the crisis has shown these two bodies to be quite ineffective in their current forms?
Yeah, I think whether by intent or lack of intent, these institutions have had a lot of bluster and a lot of rhetoric, but at the end of the day have not had effective action. There have been people on the UN emphasizing dialogue, people in the Arab League emphasizing the arming of the weapons for quite some time. Both approaches, or both ways in which they've carried out their approaches, have been unsuccessful. I think the most important thing to happen now is there to be a broadening coalition of people saying, look, this violence has reached a stage that is too much. This regime has reached its end. Let's find a united way to pressure the situation to end. Not to have rhetoric against Russia and Iran, or Russia and Iran against the US and Europe. That really is not helpful. It forgets the Syrian people who are at the center of this conflict, whose situation is continually exacerbating, and of course the humanitarian situation where you talked about the 1 million refugees, you talked about the others affecting Jordan, Turkey,
sure.
etc.
Just in a word, we're almost out of time, Tawfiq.
Sure.
A year on, for the 3rd anniversary, what would you expect this time next year?
I mean, it's hard to get into the game of predictions. I would see that a year from now, Bashar al-Assad will have left the scene. He has it in his place that there will be an election, and whatever that means. So I do think there's an end of the regime, but I think what we will have happen is one of two scenarios. One is the complete collapse of the Syrian regime and a chaotic situation that would be akin to Iraq and Afghanistan unfolding in Syria. And the second, if it happens in any way, is some type of collaborative transition in which you have accepted members of the old regime who defect, as well as newer members of the opposition coming together in terms of some type of loose governance structure in Syria.
Well, that obviously the second option sounds like a preferable one.
Better, a little bit,
but we'll hope to.
So.
I guess we'll hope to see something positive in the year ahead. Tawfiq, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
After the break,